Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our joint UNA UK and GAPS event. I am Anchi Pankania, Chief Operations Officer at UNA UK. UNA UK is the only UK charity dedicated to building support for the UN. We are a grassroots organisation with over 30,000 supporters and over 100 UNA groups across the UK. We believe that a strong, credible and effective UN is vital if we are to build a better future. And an effective UN is essential if we are to meet today's urgent global challenges, such as the climate crisis. Women and girls are often the most affected by climate change. They face greater risks and burdens, especially in poorer countries, where they are likely to suffer the most when shortages are caused. Women here also lack land and property rights and are more likely to be displaced in climate disasters. The effects of climate change and security for women and girls across the globe must not be underestimated, in particular in conflict and post-conflict settings. World leaders must ensure women, peace and security are at the heart of all discussions. This year also marks the 21st anniversary of Women, Peace and Security, and as world leaders discuss the future of our planet, when climate change is dominating the international community, it is essential we use this opportunity to remind decision makers of the importance of involving women in climate talks and actions. We are therefore pleased to be hosting this event today to explore the climate, gender, and security nexus. And on that note, I'm pleased to introduce this event's chair, Eva Tabassum. Eva is the Policy, Advocacy and Communications Manager at GAPS. She has worked across Europe and the Middle East, focusing on gender, youth participation and refugee law. Prior to joining GAPS, Eva worked in non-profit and humanitarian sectors, as well as the UK civil service. She holds a Master's in Women, Peace and Security from the London School of Economics, with a strong focus on gender, conflict and human rights. I am delighted to welcome Eva to this event.
Thank you, Angie, and thank you for your welcoming remarks. I'm really looking forward to this important discussion that will come out of today's event. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us at today's event. As Angie mentioned, I work at Gender Action for Peace and Security, which is the UK civil society working on women, peace and security. We work with our members, UNA UK being one of the members, partners and governments, as well as multilateral agencies, to progress the women, peace and security agenda. Our aim is to essentially turn the rhetoric and the very many commitments to women and girls into implementation and action. And we're so lucky today to be joined by a phenomenal panel of activists, academics, experts, NGOs and government. So as we mark the 21st anniversary of Women, Peace and Security and the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of Parties in Glasgow, GAPS, the Women's International Peace Centre and the Elysee Centre for Women, Peace and Security are pleased to publish a policy brief called Defending the Future, Gender, Conflict, Environmental Peace. You can find this brief in the chat, in the Q&A box. This policy brief follows a report of the same title that was published early this year, and essentially it outlines the gendered impact of climate change and how this intersects with women and girls' right to peace, as well as laying out 10 key recommendations that the international community can consider when addressing the lived realities of women at the intersection of climate change, conflict and gender equality. We're lucky to be joined by Susan McKinsey from the Women's International Peace Centre today, who will speak a bit about this briefing. And then we'll hear from the rest of the brilliant panel on their work and their thoughts in terms of the gender security climate nexus. And then we'll open to the audience for question and answer for about 25 minutes. I won't offer any reflections after speakers, so you can hear from them more than from me, and then we can launch straight into the question and answer. Should you have any questions, please use the question and answer box, do write it in there, and then we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. Our speakers know that sadly I will have to jump in if we run over a little bit over time, so panel, forgive me, it's just to respect each other's time. And you can find details for the social media in the online. We're tweeting at gaps_network and at UNA UK. So now I will introduce our first panelist, Susan McKinsey. Susan is the Research, Monitoring and Evaluation Officer at Women's International Peace Centre. She's undertaken research on women's rights in situations of post-conflict reconstruction in Uganda. And Susan aspires to be an agent of social change and transformation wherever she can. I will now hand over to Susan to present the findings and the recommendations of the Defending the Future policy brief. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Eve. She has already introduced me, McKinsey Susan. I work for Women's International Peace Center that formerly was called ISIS Wiki. And in 2019, we rebranded Women's International Peace Center, a name that reflects our core focus on igniting women's leadership, amplifying voice, and deepening their activism in creating peace. We are here to talk about the research that we carried out, Defending the Future, Gender Conflict and Environmental Peace, that was carried out in partnership with the London School of Economics, Center for Women, Peace and Security, GAPS, and the Women International Peace Center. The research used the methodology of an in-depth semi-interview structures where we reached out to different categories of persons. We interviewed journalists, teachers, lawyers, women and girls' rights activists, politicians, academia, UN officers, and different representatives from international organizations. This research also, basically the people we did with an in-depth, we specialized in different areas, some of them in environment, such as forestry, land rights, land trainer, conflict, gender equality, and women, peace and security agenda. We also conducted focus group discussions those were conducted in Uganda in 2 districts, that's Yumbe and Jumani, and they looked at both the host community and also the refugees. Here we reached out to a total of 90 women and girls. And the project in totality reached out to 120 participants. That's including the roundtable dialogue that was held in January in London. The purpose of why we did this research is we were focusing on gender impact of climate change and how this intersects with women and girls' rights to peace. We recognize that there's a need for women, peace and security agendas to be put into account how climate crisis pose crisis for women's peace security, particularly those in post-conflict and conflict areas. The research itself it looked out at basically 3 issues on gender impacts of climate and environmental insecurities, women, peace and security, environment, peace building, climate change and environment-related migration and displacement, feminist solutions for environmental peace, and then the women defending the resilience of environment and women's rights defenders.
Oh, I think we've lost Susan. I think we've lost Susan, so I'll move on to the next panelist. Our next speaker is Diana Dalton. Diana Dalton is the Deputy Director and Head of Gender Equalities at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, with a responsibility for gender equality, gender-based violence, child protection, LGBT+ rights, disability inclusion and social protection. Before joining the UK civil service, Diana worked in the international development NGO sector. I will now hand over to Diana for her presentation. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we've lost Susan, but anyway, I'm sure we'll allow her to come back in as soon as she's managed to reconnect. Bit of a pain, this technology thing. Well, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to just say a few words at the early stages of this event on behalf of the UK government. I'm sure you were all following things very closely over the past week or so at COP, and particularly yesterday at Gender Day, on the issues around gender and climate. And it's so important that we recognise that link between gender and climate security, and the link back, obviously, here to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which all of us are pretty active on. And as the UK took its centre stage for COP, as pen holders on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, we have been really conscious of and trying to work very hard to ensure that the rights of women and girls are recognised as central to all discussions on all issues climate related over the course of COP. And we're really proud, therefore, to have supported this vital piece of research, and it's going to play an important role in informing the UK's future approach to women, peace and security. I'm a bit nervous about going too much into the issues, because I know that you'll all be pretty well informed and others have more dimensions to add. But just to start with a little bit of that context, it's the evidence is really stark that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And I'm not going to go into all the stats that we have at our fingertips on that, but it is important to recognise that the differentiated impacts of climate change on men and women can really be explained through a combination of discrimination, socio-cultural barriers, and existing inequality, as opposed to some kind of inherent vulnerability. So we must really avoid the narratives of women solely as victims of climate insecurity and focus on the fundamental issue that needs addressing immediately, which is that women and girls are often left out or unable to participate fully in decision-making on climate action. So the intersection of women, peace and security, climate change, ecological destruction, and conflict or post-conflict situation is obviously complex, and a holistic response is required. So just going back to how we've tried to frame our approach on gender at COP, it's not always completely easy to make even internally in the FCDO, with this being a huge UK priority as hosts of COP, to actually make the gender argument land. And we've been really focused on doing that by drawing out the importance of the three areas of agency in relation to the empowerment and education of women and girls to be leaders in climate action and the green economy, adaptation in relation to building women and girls' resilience to climate impacts, including through quality education again, but also social protection, disaster preparedness. And then finally, advancing gender equality through finance. So delivering climate finance that focuses on the economic empowerment of women and girls, and then addresses the barriers that women face in accessing the funds that are flowing is absolutely critical. It's too often falling into the hands of others who are not on the front line, who are not the first responders in the event of a climate crisis. So we feel that if all of these, if addressed properly and in balance, will lead to better quality climate programming and policy with a higher return, ultimately achieving better outcomes. So it therefore probably goes without saying that the UK are committed to implementing the Gender Action Plan agreed at COP25 through our domestic and international climate policies, action and finance. And we really working hard to use the presidency platform to strongly encourage other parties to do the same. Yesterday we used the Gender Rhetoric COP to drive forward progress on this and encourage wider action. But of course, to do that, we have to lead by example. And that's why we joined a UN Women convened coalition on the Feminist Action for Climate Justice. And through that, we make commitments to champion women and girls' climate leadership, education and decision-making in climate action, building their resilience to climate change and deliver truly gender responsive climate finance. Our COP26 adaptation and resilience campaign will make women and girls safer from climate related disasters by addressing the distinct and disproportionate risks they face. And we've also developed specific policies and targets to enhance diversity and gender equality in renewable energy sectors. So we've signed up to initiatives like the Clean Energy Ministerial Education and Empowerment Initiative, and that aims to further enhance women's leadership in the sector. Obviously, the reason we're all here today is that we've got to do more collectively. So we really welcome the recommendations set out, and as you know, as they capture concrete ways in which we can make a difference, all of us, making a reality of women's full, equal and meaningful participation and protection in all aspects of peace and security, including the response to the climate emergency, is something that still seems far too sporadic, piecemeal, both at international and national level. So what we need to see is the participation of all women, including Indigenous groups, at all levels and at all stages of decision-making processes. Just to dig a little deeper on this, there are obviously important issues to consider. This is quite a general statement to make. So the important issues that I want to make sure that are considered are ensuring that there is a protection of women who are working to sustain and build peace, including on climate. That's not by no means a given. And so the UK were proud to support the International Civil Society Action Network in the development of a protection framework. This, for those of you who don't know, it provides guidance to states and to multilateral organisations on how best to prevent and respond to reprisals against women. We must assess the gendered impact of climate change and ensure that solutions are developed with women, not for them. So we must ensure that conflict and peace building projects, programmes, policy and research are based on gender, conflict, environmental analysis. And the UK also recognises the important role of women's rights organisations, human rights defenders and environmental defenders, who are really critical partners on the ground. So who we partner with and how we approach all of this is really key to effectiveness. And that includes working with them on the development of national action plans on women, peace and security, which are just one way to address climate insecurity, but very important way. We're in the early stages of developing our next national action plan on women, peace and security, which is due to commence in 2023. And that's also an opportunity presented to raise ambition and to address some of the challenges and recommendations that are being presented here today. So I'm going to finish there. I just want to thank you once again for the opportunity to speak today. And I'm sure a number of the elements that I've mentioned here just now will be raised in more detail later on in the discussion. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back to the chair. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. Sorry, I was on mute there. I will now go back to our first panelist, Susan McKinsey. I'll just reintroduce her again. So Susan is the Research Monitoring and Evaluation Officer at Women's International Peace Centre. She has undertaken research on women's rights in situations of post-conflict reconstruction in Uganda. Susan aspires to be an agent of social change and transformation wherever she can. I will now hand over to Susan to present the findings and recommendations of the Defending the Future brief. Thanks. Susan, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute. Oh, I think there's still a problem, Susan.
Unmuted, is it clear now?
We can hear you now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Apologies for that. I don't know how I dropped off. Thank you. I talked about the purpose of the research as we are focusing on gender impact to the climate change and how it intersects with women and girls' right to peace. The report also highlighted the growing recognition of the need to have the women and girls into the recognition of the need for the women, peace and security agenda to take into account how the climate crisis poses risks to women and girls' security, particularly those in conflict and post-conflict setting, looking at issues of, the findings looked at issues of food security, water insecurity, displacement as issues affecting women due to extreme weather and climate emergencies. We also looked at the issues of famine, poor living standards, the long distances that women move, the lack of access and land control, poverty and climate due to the sometimes due to the delayed reliefs that they wait for. All this, we realize that the intersection of women, peace and security, climate change, ecological destruction and conflict and post-conflict situations raise a key issue that yes, women, this sector, that women need to engage and be part of these issues. The key recommendations that we identified from the research is to ensure that women and girls participate equally and meaningfully in decision making that affect their lives, that we should ensure that they are acknowledging the different technical experts in issues of climate change, in the environment, conflict, peace building, and to be able to participate in decision-making spaces, undertake participatory gender, conflict, environment analysis. We should ensure that conflict and peace building processes, especially policies, researches, are based on participatory intersection, gender, conflict, environment analysis that includes and assesses and responds to the issues of climate and the structure and root causes. Or another recommendation is to ensure that women human rights are at all centers of responses to climate, peace, conflict, and gender, and also to address the different intersections, especially the issues of gender, peace, and conflict. Another recommendation is to be inclusive, that at least they should recognize and support the different traditional solutions to gender and environment. Also, we looked at another recommendation that we should support the human rights defenders, especially those who are dealing on issues of environment and climate change. We should address the challenges of corporate powers and also to build the capacities of the different international communities, and especially also the organizations that are working on the issues of gender, conflict, and environment peace. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for giving me the space and listening to me.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for your presentation. I will now introduce the next speaker. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Smith. Elizabeth is a research assistant in SPIRI's Climate Change and Risk Programme. Her research currently focuses on climate security, peace building, and gender. She graduated as a member of the inaugural master's class in Women, Peace and Security from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2018. I will now hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the hosts of the event. It's really great. I'm really happy to be here. So I am coming to you from Stockholm. I work at the Climate Change and Risk Programme at SPIRI. And I'd like to bringing both focuses of addressing the human security impacts of climate change itself on women and girls, as well as intersecting effects of climate change and conflict into the women, peace and security agenda is important. And the Defending the Future report did a really excellent job of highlighting that. Climate change can not only create risks to human security, which impact women and girls, but it can also indirectly impact the risk of violent conflict, and it negatively impacts sustainable peace. As other speakers have mentioned, in many different contexts, women and girls are affected both by the respective and compounding effects of climate change and conflict due to existing inequalities they experience related to gender roles within their societies. And but they are also can be crucial agents of change in addressing both climate change and conflict. And while they should be able to address climate-related security risks as they can experience them, and as well as in certain contexts, they have crucial and specific knowledge about their environment that can be invaluable to both adaptation mitigation as well as peace building. Their participation in addressing these issues has historically not been consistently supported. So on that note, I'm going to talk a bit more about two related points that the Defending the Future report highlighted. So namely linkages between gender, climate and environmental security, as well as women's participation and the development of comprehensive national action plans linked to climate change and the environment, one of the recommendations of the report. So in the report, it's visible how gender inequalities and gendered responsibilities affect impacts for women and girls in contexts affected by climate change. So interviews noted that the lack of access to resources, particularly land, could increase risks for women and girls, and as well as the potential heightened risk of gender-based violence when traveling farther distances to gather water and other resources. The impacts of climate change the impacts of conflict can further exacerbate and heighten risks for women and girls, with the report noting particular risks faced during migration and displacement. And for women and girls who are experiencing compounding forms of marginalization due to other identity markers such as disability or ethnicity, they can experience even further heightened risks. Research from CPRI supports this as well, noting that in Somalia, women and girls in IDP camps, as noted by the report, and as well as many other instances of research, note that women experience particular risks of exposure to sexual and gender-based violence. And during displacement, traditional social mechanisms to protect against harassment and violence can be disrupted, which can put women from ethnic minority groups in often a particularly vulnerable situation. The other thing I wanted to talk about that was also featured in the report was the relationship between gender, climate change, and shifting gender roles. So in the report, interviewees noted how shifting weather patterns in some cases pushed men to take over roles traditionally held by women, livelihood roles traditionally held by women, which impacted the livelihoods of women, and who were still compelled to maintain their original domestic responsibilities. So this trend is also evident across other research, including within recent research that CBRE has conducted on climate-related security risks and peace building in Mali and Somalia. So in a past report on Mali, it was clear that both conflict and climate change contributed to shifts in gender norms and relations. So interviews with peacekeeping mission staff and UN country team officers noted that that women, children, and the elderly are often the primary residents in different villages and IDP camps, since men are likely to be engaged elsewhere due to circumstances related to the conflict, or potentially they may also be dead. As a result, women are compelled to take on more untraditional roles, including the defense of their land. And similarly in Somalia, women began to engage in trade activities that were traditionally held by men. And so in certain circumstances affected both by climate change and conflict, women may take on new roles, but if the broader structures that they exist in remain exclusionary, and perhaps they still remain disenfranchised from accessing necessary resources, this can create challenges as they take on new responsibilities and continue to hold their old ones. So going back to the second point, the recommendation about national action plans, the report highlighted the need to develop comprehensive national action plans linked to climate change and the environment. So regarding the national action plans, or NAPs, they can be considered a sort of blueprint for how states enact their commitments for commitments to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The report rightly stressed that they need to be inclusively developed, with women and girls affected by climate change participating in their creation. So the success of the plan is not determined by the simple act of adopting it. It's based on how the plans are constructed and how they're implemented. And so there has been some progress on NAPs engaging in climate change, notably, especially in the past year. A report I authored in 2020 on climate change and WPS NAPs found that 17 out of 80 states had at least one NAP that included a mention of climate change. But when you dive deeper, it's clear that even fewer had concrete actions addressing it. So all NAPs included references to climate change in their narrative or background section, with some NAPs including it just as a mention to UN Security Resolution 2242, which is the first and only resolution in the agenda that mentioned climate change. So while they all mentioned it in their narrative section, not every NAP included it in their actions. The report highlighted the 3 NAPs of Finland, the 3rd NAP of Ireland, and the 2nd NAP of the United States, as they included the most concrete actions and objectives referencing climate change. But even within these, there was still room for improvement. So while all included actions supporting the participation of women, including in addressing climate change, which is positive, it wasn't necessarily clear who exactly they were supporting. And nor was it clear how they may address climate-related security risks experienced by women domestically. These NAPs tended to look outwards, and by that I mean they were donor states with interventions seemingly aimed abroad and not touching explicitly on domestic concerns for women related to climate change and the environment. So as states progressively integrate climate-related security risks into their NAPs, as the Defending the Future report stressed, it is necessary to contextually understand the experiences of women and girls and what structural challenges different groups of women and girls may be experiencing that inhibit them from either participating in decision making or adapting to their changing environment. And I would note that since then, there is a certain amount of apparent momentum with certain country national action plans having been renewed or published that feature climate change as an issue in narratives, actions, and objectives. And I would highlight Uganda and Germany as two that immediately come to mind, which includes significant focus on climate change. And so with that, I think, and with that, I will conclude and turn it back over to Eva.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really interesting. I'll now move on to our final speaker. Our next speaker is Crystal Downing. Crystal is a Columbia Case study manager at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research on the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project. Prior to joining UNUCPR, Ms. Downing was a senior policy advisor at the Permanent Mission of the UK to the United Nations. She held a Security Council portfolio that included Colombia, Venezuela, and Women, Peace and Security, leading and representing the UK in Security Council processes, including the drafting and negotiations of the resolutions and other products. I'll now hand over to Crystal for her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ava. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen, if that's possible, to share some findings from our Colombia work at the MAYAC project. Let's see, thanks. So, is that showing up for everyone? I'm going to assume that's a yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Great. Thanks. Thanks very much to UNA UK and to GAPS for this invitation to speak at this important and timely event. So just to give a bit of background very quickly about the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict projects, we aim to understand how and why individuals exit armed groups and which interventions most effectively support their full and sustained transitions to civilian life. And within that, we really are looking at both the interventions that support those individuals and conflict prevention and resolution interventions in the communities where they're reintegrating. And as you can see from this kind of logo of logos here, we've got several partners throughout the UN system, as well as our generous donor member state partners, of which the UK SCDO is supporting our Colombia work. So on the Colombia work, just to get a bit of context on the findings that I'm going to present, we carried out a community phone survey in April to May of this year in 11 municipalities, of which 8 are rural conflict affected municipalities. So obviously, as many of you probably know, Colombia is a very biodiverse country, one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, which makes it unfortunately highly vulnerable to a range of climate change dynamics. It also makes it particularly attractive for both legal and illegal entities to carry out extractive economic activities and others that affect the natural environment, including deforestation, mining, and oil drilling. And in the case of deforestation especially, this activity has increased since the 2016 peace agreement, as the FARC EP, who obviously were signatories to the agreement, exited certain spaces and have kind of opened up, that kind of space has opened up for the purchase of affordable land in densely wooded areas, which has led to people purchasing more land for logging. FARC dissident groups are also incentivizing deforestation because it allows them to open up new corridors of communication for the transport of illegal goods, including drugs, through previously forested areas. So there's a lot of kind of new, recent trends that have increased over the last 5 years, in addition to long-standing and ever worsening climate change dynamics. Just a quick note, so in the survey, we did distinguish between what we're calling climate change, being the changes in rainfall and temperature, and what we're calling human-induced environmental degradation, which is deforestation, mining, and oil drilling. Doesn't mean to say that we don't obviously recognize the strong and cyclical relationship between those two kind of areas of climatic shifts, but for the purposes of the questions that we were asking, we did make that distinction. So I think these findings that I'm going to present on the next 3 slides really drive home some of the points that have already been made in the briefing and the report, on especially around intersectionality and the need to address kind of all of these issues in a really comprehensive way. So the first finding, the first data point is around this question: has your community experienced any of the following because of changes in rainfall and temperature? And as we can see here, so the displacement, conflicts over resources and land, and disputes over water were all reported in all 11 municipalities in the survey, but much higher levels of reporting in rural contexts. And within that, we saw that Afro-Colombian and Indigenous women were reported the highest levels of displacement. 43% of Afro-Colombian women reported displacement as a result of changes in rainfall and temperature, compared to 28% of Afro-Colombian men, and 29% of Indigenous women reported this impact, compared to 21% of Indigenous men. And this, we believe this has a lot to do with kind of already fragile livelihoods, fragile tenureship and holdings over land, that when affected by these climatic shifts becomes a kind of breaking point that causes displacement. But further research on this is certainly needed. We asked a similar question: has your community experienced any of the following as a direct result of changes in deforestation, mining, and/or oil drilling? And again, saw this difference, though less so, between rural and urban communities in all 3 of these dynamics: displacement, conflicts over resources and land, and disputes over water. And again, saw that Afro-Colombian and Indigenous groups reported the highest levels of these dynamics, but the kind of the difference between women and men within those groups was inverted in the case of Indigenous groups. So for Afro-Colombians, 17% of Afro-Colombian women reported disputes over water in this case, rather than displacement, as a result of these changes, compared to 12% of Afro-Colombian men. The difference for displacement was slightly less, and we didn't find that it was significant when we analysed it. And for Indigenous respondents, the trend was actually reversed, and a lot more Indigenous men respondents reported disputes over water. 29% of Indigenous men, in fact, compared to 11% of Indigenous women, which I think is an important reminder of the fact that, like, these gender analyses shouldn't always focus on the impact of these dynamics on women, but also to really try and understand the gendered impact across genders, and explore why those dynamics take place. Finally, the third data point that I wanted to discuss today, we asked about the linkages between armed group recruitment and climatic shifts, and we believe that this is the first data in Colombia that really strongly draws the connection between climate shifts and armed group recruitment. So we asked 2 questions that are both kind of represented in this slide. One was, do you know anyone who joined an armed group due to economic difficulties caused by changes in rainfall and temperature? And the other one was the same question, but due to joining an armed group due to economic difficulties caused by changes in deforestation, mining, and oil drilling. And as you can see from the graph, in rural areas, 15% of respondents reported knowing someone who had joined an armed group due to climate change, so changes in rainfall and temperature. 16% reported knowing someone who had joined an armed group due to human-induced environmental degradation, so deforestation, mining, and oil drilling, and those levels were slightly lower in urban areas where obviously armed groups are less present, and so there's slightly less recruitment. I think here, in terms of kind of the gendered impact of this finding, what it means for women, especially women in rural areas who who perhaps are fulfilling more traditional gender roles and have more fragile incomes or rely on their partners for incomes. If those incomes are highly affected by these climatic shifts, then they might be more likely to join armed groups as a way to compensate or to support themselves, a means to find kind of sustenance when the economic situation is impacted, but also puts additional pressures. And I think this goes back to one of the points made earlier about the roles of women in overcoming these many of these issues. It puts additional pressure on local women-led conflict de-escalation and recruitment prevention efforts, because obviously as these kind of climatic shifts increase, and especially around deforestation, which we know is increasing at the moment, as those shifts increase and the impacts become more acute, those efforts are going to be more needed, and women-led efforts are going to be particularly under pressure and need more support to continue to carry out their work. So just looking at the policy implications of all of this, I think a lot of these, although we did obviously write them for the Colombian context, they're certainly adaptable to other areas as well, and touch on many of the points that have already been made today. So two of the areas that we highlighted in the work, one is the cyclical and mutually reinforcing relationship between climate change and conflict-related dynamics such as displacement, and especially their impact on different ethnic groups and women in particular, and the links between climate change and armed group recruitment and the potential impacts on women and their roles in overcoming these challenges. So the peace agreement, I mean, is one of these existing tools that should be used to address both security and livelihood issues relating to climatic shifts and gender. It has, a broad range of gender provisions in addition to others that apply to climate and security. And if comprehensively implemented, could make a real impact and a positive impact in addressing the dynamics that we've seen in the data. This includes expanded non-military state presence, including local justice mechanisms that could adjudicate land disputes and other issues, and other kind of non-military presence of the state in rural areas that have been affected by conflict and that are currently now being affected by these climatic shifts. And as others have alluded to, the inclusion and opportunities for equal, meaningful, and full equal and meaningful participation by women, but particularly, I think, but taking an intersectional lens to that participation and making sure that the groups, ethnic groups at all levels are able to participate in intersectional efforts. Finally, just kind of like thinking a bit more broadly about climate change and gender insecurity at the UN. I've been reading this book. I don't know if anyone's read it, but the First Political Order. I'm not very far through it. It's taken me a while, but it's an excellent book and draws a lot of the connections between the issues that we're discussing today. But one of the things that it does is really presents hard data on gender equality as both a predictor and a result of conflict and instability, and shows that societies that take better care of their environment generally have higher levels of gender equality and are more stable. So I think it's a really interesting kind of way to illustrate what we're talking about here. And we know that given these linkages, gender and climate should permeate every aspect of the UN's work. The UN's work, as we know, is kind of often siloed into different areas, but in the same way that we've been talking about for years, the fact that gender should be a cross-cutting issue. I think we're now kind of presenting more evidence and finding more motivation to make climate a cross-cutting issue across the UN's work as well. And particularly at the Security Council, I think there's a lot of lessons that could be learned from the way that the WPS agenda has developed in how the council is beginning to address climate and security issues, particularly in the informal experts group, which is the climate change IEG has been modeled on the WPS IEG. And I think there's a lot to be said for for continuing to draw those lessons learned, and also to see how perhaps like joint action could be taken by both IEGs, or there could be kind of cross-pollination between the two on information exchange to really inform the council's work. And on that point, finally, I think intersectional analysis is going to be key to understanding the interaction between all these different issues, and breaking down those silos, not just at the UN, but also I think just across the breadth of sectors that work on these issues, not just looking at climate or gender or security, but making sure that we're seeing all of them as interconnected and responding to the need to address them comprehensively. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Crystal. That was really interesting, and thank you for your presentation. Nice to see something visual as well. I'm now going to head into the question and answer part of this event, and if I may, I might open up with a chair's question, and actually touching on some of your recommendations, Crystal. I guess, we know, we've heard from the panelists today that, climate change disproportionately impacts women and girls. And despite this, we continuously to see climate change policies and programs, including the national determined contributions to climate change, not include gender. And we had the Gender Day at COP yesterday, and that's welcomed, of course. But I would argue that gender is siloed. It's always separate. It's never integrated. And it has to integrate across all climate change policies and programs for actually gender transformative change. So, when we have gender that's included in national adaptation plans for climate change, they're often not costed. When we have women, peace and security national action plans that Elizabeth touched on, again, it's not concrete, tangible actions, and then furthermore, they're not costed. So, yesterday, a couple of countries announced funding. The US, for example, announced some funding, but it wasn't new funding. It didn't seem like it was new funding. It seemed like it was from existing pots of money. So is gender just rhetoric? I don't know. Dana, maybe if I start with you. Alok Sharma announced 165 million of new funding yesterday. Will this be new funding to address the disproportionate gendered impact of climate change, and how will this be used to tackle these obstacles and barriers that the panel have addressed?
So yeah, I have to say that I'm probably not supposed to say this on behalf of the UK government, but I agree with you. It is far too siloed, and it is the job of my department inside the FCDO to make that case internally as well. And we have been working really hard with the COP team and with the Climate and Environment Department inside our own organisation to make sure that we've got a really strong gender offer. One of the things that we're supportive of, it wasn't announced yesterday, but we are very supportive of, is the gender responsive financing issue, and that's something that the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Action Coalition is pushing for a gender target. We do think it's completely achievable within all climate programming that takes place, that if you have embed gender objectives within them, it's not to achieve gender equality. Well, it will achieve greater gender equality, but it will achieve more effective programming, because we know where women are positioned within the sort of climate context, if you like. They are at the front end, they are the responders, they are the most adversely affected, and they're not participating in decision making. So that's something that we've made that case. We've put up submissions to ministers to basically say this is something that we think is entirely doable and is the right thing to do. So and I think we're getting progress, but there always will be situations where you have some sort of programming or project intervention that hasn't considered those issues adequately enough. One of the arguments that we make internally is about the fact that we are adhering to the Gender Equality Act that's embedded into the international development act, and we have to report on that. So it is really important that all parts of the organisation, whatever they are spending money on, is able to adequately report back on the way in which they have stayed true to the Gender Equality Act and fulfilled those obligations. In all future business planning, we also have that embedded into requirements as we plan for the next spending review period, and that would go for climate programming as well. So you know, I mean, it's work in progress. You know, in a way, we were saying, why have Gender Day at COP? Why not actually just have a gender conversation in every single other session? But on the other hand, I think yesterday did a good job at raising awareness of the issues, and there were some very impassioned speakers there, female speakers who could talk from personal experience and actually showcase women's participation and voice in this debate. So maybe for now there's still a real place for it, but I'll let you move on to some of the other speakers.
Thank you, Jana. Would anybody else like to come in on this?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
I suppose is gender just rhetoric? I mean, I think it's a hard question. I think there's definitely an element of rhetoric, but I also think that it's important that that stakeholders are able to make public commitments and to announce and to kind of, you know, get the momentum going around these issues in a really public way. And I think that's what's happening. You know, that's what's happening at COP. That I think what we'll be telling is whether or not is the kind of action that's taken in the wake of COP26 and to see where it takes us all. I think who knows? I don't know. I mean, I think it would be interesting to ask someone who was around at the time of, you know, in 2000, at the time that 1325 was adopted, if these kinds of questions were arising, and if people thought, you know, oh well, yeah, you know, everyone says that we have this WPS agenda now, but is that really going to make a difference? And here we are 21 years later, and I think it has made a huge difference. There's an enormous amount of work still to do, but I don't think anyone would want to imagine a world without it. So you know, I think the same goes hopefully for climate change. You know, even if progress is slow, and I think especially with climate change, we know that it can't continue at the pace that it's you know, change can't continue at the pace that it's been in the past. But I think there's a certain amount of rhetoric is kind of needed to get cohesion around the issues and drive momentum and change. It's just a matter of putting that rhetoric into action afterwards.
Thank you, Crystal. Elizabeth, Susan, would you like to come in at all? Okay, I'll move on to the next question. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I'll just pick the top one. Gabriel from Conciliation Resources would really like to hear the panel's understanding of how gendered norms, expectations, and power relations can affect the relationship between climate change and conflict. Crystal, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking it through. How gendered norms, expectations, and power relations can affect the relationship with climate change and conflict. I mean, I think I think just kind of thinking through the data that we have from our Columbia study and that I presented, especially in rural areas of Colombia, and there we have other questions in the survey that we've presented in a gender report that we published last week. In the rural areas where we carried out the survey, we can see that that women often fulfill traditional gender roles. They're often kind of focused on the home, and there are certainly, we asked the question, for example, about whether or not women need the protection of men in order to survive, and we could see that rural men were the most likely to answer positively, and I think more than 60% of them answered positively, whereas like rural, urban women, I mean, it was a very logical kind of breakdown. Urban women were the least likely to respond positively. I think it was around 5% or something. So through that and other questions, we can see that women are often fulfilling traditional gender roles, and these are also the areas that are most affected by conflict, and they're now the areas that are most affected by climate change. And so what does that mean? It means that in decision making about responses and adaptation to climate change, women are often not at the table, and they're not able to their voices are not heard in the efforts to respond to these dynamics. It means that the efforts that women have already led and made to address conflict resolution in these areas are not necessarily able to adapt as quickly to climate change because they don't have the resources, they don't have the support at the local level or at the national level or indeed at the international level to respond. And so kind of it just translates, it sort of trickles up and down throughout the response to this kind of nexus. And hopefully, I mean, as I said in this book, the nexus is really highlighted. I hope that it means that the efforts to support women-led initiatives would also mean that climate change, climate efforts are kind of more supported, and conflict resolution efforts are more supported as well. So I think there's a kind of, that I guess is the way that I would see it. But it's definitely an interesting question. I'd be interested to hear what other panelists have to say.
Does anyone else want to come in, Susan?
Yes, thank you so much. You talked about how gender norms, expectation variations can affect the relationship between climate change and conflict. You realize that gender relations or gender issues, that within the different settings and cultures, women are the most people who are affected, especially who are the people who carry out the different activities. For example, they're the ones who go out there looking for firewood, move long distances, maybe to look for grass for touching their houses, looking for firewood. They don't have, they have limited access or control over land, the issues of property rights. So yes, I believe that gender norms is a way they are affecting the climate, because if women are the ones who are doing all this and they are not invited to the different issues of the different tables of decision making, different issues are not really addressed. For example, if we are to deal with issues of climate, how are we handling the issues of how are they going to manage the firewood, because they are now still using the firewood. They are looking for water in the different long distances, which is also impacting to them, as along the way you do never know what would happen because they'll be moving to different issues. So in case we are to talk about the different issues, how are we analyzing that? How are we linking in gender, climate, and the different roles that women play in society? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth, did you want to come in at all?
Oh, it's okay. We can go to the next one.
I can move on to the next question, Diana, unless you would like to come in on this.
No, I don't think I've got anything to add, to be honest. I suppose the only other point I would make is that there is, well, historically, we've funded a lot of development programming that has focused on, breaking down the many barriers to women's empowerment, which are all entirely relevant in this context. So I think that it's the linkages between what's gone before and what we've learned with this very present issue. But I haven't got any more detail than that to add.
Thank you. I think this is a question for you, Crystal. I think it's based on your presentation. It's from Miravat Rishmawi. Are there differences on the impact of women in different ages, young women as opposed to childbearing age, as opposed to older women?
That's a great question. So we did analyze by age, and we didn't find that it was statistically significant in terms of its impact on different ages. But I do think that it makes sense that it could, and I think we should. I think further research is needed to really understand that in more detail. So sorry, it's not really a satisfactory answer, but I think at least it points to a need for further work to understand those dynamics.
Thank you. And there's a question for Elizabeth. Are you able to recall the NAPs that you mentioned as good examples in terms of national action plans that take climate change into account?
Yes, so the three that I had highlighted in the original analysis were the three NAPs of Finland, who had included, which had included climate change in each progression of its NAP. Ireland, the third National Action Plan of Ireland, and the second National Action Plan of the United States, but that has since expired. But then I also added that since the publication of the report, other national action plans, and I noted Germany and Uganda, have been published that included significantly more mention of climate change in actions and objectives.
Thank you. We have a question. We've touched on the need for joint approach by Rachel Williams. We've touched on the need for joint approaches, nexus, integration, linkages of issues, but are we including all the right people and expertise in this global discussion? To what extent are we / should we be incorporating the defence sector? Diana, can I give this one to you?
In what ways are we incorporating who? The defence sector?
The defence sector, yeah.
Right, well, I'm going to declare here that I'm not a conflict expert, so I don't know the sort of baseline of the degree to which they are already engaged in debates and discussions. But obviously, when you are talking about a kind of HMG response in a conflict setting, then that would be a joined up sort of political development defence offer. So, you know, we'd certainly on our side would engage with the relevant staff, but beyond that, at national level, I have to say I don't know what's already happened. It would be a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned to ensure that all stakeholders are engaged in the discussion and the response, and again that, you know, that they are party to the design of something that comes out and is or is not funded by the UK government. But yeah, I haven't got anything more to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come into this? Does the defence sector have a role to play in responding to climate and conflict risks?
Yeah, I could say I have a few thoughts, I suppose, and I'm thinking again of the Colombian case, but I think there are lessons to be translated elsewhere. I mean, I think the defense sector is often engaged on the security side, obviously, and in the Colombian case, I think at the moment, you know, looking at the FARC dissident groups, that's where, you know, tackling those groups is where the defense sector is absolutely engaged. Are they engaged in on the sort of tackling the FARC dissident groups' involvement in deforestation? I don't think so. I think the sort of approach is very much like, let's tackle the groups themselves, and the deforestation will decrease as a result of that, which is not necessarily the best approach. But I also wouldn't say that they should be the ones who should be, for example, providing alternative livelihood options to communities that are involved in deforestation. So I think they certainly should be engaged in the same way that they should be engaged on WPS work. It's just a matter of like the difference between what should they be taking action on, and what conversations should they be part of, so that all the different kind of stakeholders in these efforts are joined up and able to contribute where their strengths are in a really comprehensive way. But I definitely think that it's a great point, and that they should be engaged in, you know, as appropriate throughout these conversations.
Thank you. We have a question from Nicole Hagman. Will there be an evaluation? I think this is for yourself, Diana. Will there be an evaluation of the UK's current national action plan, and will it include an assessment of the nexus between climate between conflict, peace building, and the climate crisis?
Sorry, thanks for that, Nicole, and hello, Nicole. I have to say I don't know actually whether or not there's a planned evaluation. This is work that has actually gone out of a different department from me, but I can find out and let you know. I'm sure there'll be some onward communication, but yeah, I mean, I would say it's obviously important to certainly have some real-time learning and review of progress in relation to whether or not a full-scale evaluation is an appropriate way forward. I'm always of the school of thought that having a learning strategy and a kind of monitoring plan that actually combines that real-time learning to be able to sort of course correct, if you like, alongside some longer term learning is really important, because having worked on evaluations myself, sometimes it's the timeliness of it that is really critical, and particularly when we're talking about these issues where you don't have a lot of time, and urgency is the most important thing. So I am sure there's a strong learning strategy, but I'll follow up and let you know what I find out.
Thank you. Another question we have is how do economic structures impact the severity of climate change and gender inequality? What changes need to take place at a structural level? Does anyone want to come in on this question?
I could come in on that. I mean, I suppose the way that I would look at it is how economic structures allow or don't allow communities to adapt to climate change and to resolve gender inequality. I think especially in areas where there aren't a huge amount of livelihood options in the first place, and those livelihood options have been structured around traditional gender roles, it's much more difficult for them to kind of adapt and to find ways to shift their economic kind of outlook to in the new kind of climate situation or context, and that again, that's kind of, I think, where displacement begins to become more common, is when they have to, communities have to move. In terms of gender inequality, I think again, it's a matter of making sure that women have equal opportunities as men do, that women are able to participate in the same economic context that men are, and that the kind of playing field is really leveled. And that will ultimately have a positive impact on gender inequality and on climate adaptation to climate change. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to come in on this?
Eva, would you mind repeating the question? I was just trying to find it in the chat and I wasn't sure which one it was.
Yeah, sure. Bear with me. It was, how do economic structures impact the severity of climate change and gender inequality? What changes need to take place at a structural level?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I can think of adding to that at the moment is around, again, access to finance and the control that women have of their own sort of household budgets. I don't know if that's the sort of thing they're referring to, but obviously that, again, going back to what's gone before and what's appropriate to build on in terms of programming and responses. There's a lot of previous work around, banking and reach to, for example, women-headed households, to allow them to benefit from the funds that are flowing. And so obviously you need the economic structures to allow that, and for also in terms of social norms for women to be able to, it's difficult, but to be able to take control of the finance at a whole household level when they are not when they are in a sort of more traditional family setup. So I think there are issues around the economic structures of banking. Social protection is a really key area for us. The policy team for social protection is based within my department, but obviously the actual social protection support is going out from all parts of the organisation at a country level, and building up those shock responsive national social protection systems that can, withstand the climate shocks, sudden emergencies, is really key, and that those systems themselves are reaching the right people, that they're reaching women, and that so basically we have some quite focused work on gender responsive social protection and shock responsive social protection, working with the World Bank and others. So the design of those is really, really important to be ready to be gender responsive in the event of a crisis. So and we're definitely not there. An awful lot of the response in an emergency comes from the international community through the UN, through NGOs, and isn't actually coming via government. So that's where the World Bank is really, really key, because they have far greater levels of funding flowing than we do, and they are working directly with government on government plans. So important for us as the UK to be influencing the World Bank on how they shape their programming, given their reach, make sure it's gender responsive. But these are very, this is ongoing. This is not something that's new to them and new, no doubt, to many of you.
Thank you. Some of the presentations spoke a lot about inclusion and intersectionality when we're looking at climate change and feminist solutions. COP26 was, a lot of, there was the hashtag missing voices. A lot of people felt that they were excluded from negotiations. What can be done to better include women's rights organizations, women's rights activists, environmental defenders? Clearly they didn't feel like their voices were heard this time around. Gender transformative changes they're only going to happen if you talk to the affected communities, and we didn't see a lot of that on stage. It seems like civil society, there's a shrinking space for it. What could have been different? What could have happened differently at COP this year? And that's just open to anyone on the panel.
I think it's not quite over yet, but that's not to say that it's not over for those spaces to have been opened up. I don't feel like I have enough information to judge that yet. I have seen some quite shocking stats on the news about which sectors were represented to what degree, and actually, the numbers of LDCs represented, their kind of delegations are all relatively small compared to some others, and some of the sectors in particular that will remain nameless. So there is a real issue of balance. I do agree with that, and but on the other hand, I did see quite a lot of compelling sessions with indigenous voices, women's voices, youth voices. So I don't feel like I've seen enough to actually pass judgment yet on the balance, but it is something that should be really front and center. You've got to hear those voices to be able to have a build consensus and have a collective response. So yeah, I don't know. Ask me in 2 weeks when I've got a bit more information.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come in?
Yes, thank you so much, Evelyn. Also, I wouldn't add that much of what I think should have happened to ensure that women are included, but more I think they should try to ensure that they are they create more spaces that are more intersectional, that can allow different age groups to be represented, so that they can hear different views through, they would try to look at the different sectionality of participants. But I think we should still give it some more time to see what more is coming out. Then we could have more concrete feedback to that. Thank you.
If I could also just add, I think this is one of the instances where lessons from WPS can be learned in the climate change agenda. I mean, it's almost unthinkable to have a meeting or an event, any kind of gathering on WPS and not involve a civil society member. I mean, at least in the New York context, it's UN agencies, civil society, and member states in equal sort of proportions, if not more on the civil society side. So I think that, and it's sort of a given at this point, that's how these conversations happen, and those are the stakeholders that need to participate. So I think it's just something that maybe it needs more time to be integrated, but I think it's absolutely essential, and it's really the only way to move forward.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions and answers. So I'm just going to close now. Thank you all. Thank you, brilliant speakers on the panel. I think we've all learned a lot today, and really interesting to hear the links between gender, climate and security. Thank you all. I think, Crystal, there was just a question, quite a lot of questions about the book that you mentioned. What was it called?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I think the question then passed over to the answered section. So it's called The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. And it's by Valerie Hudson et al. And I can't yet fully recommend it because I haven't finished it, but I'm jumping around in it, and it just has really interesting data. It's very quantitative, so I'm not really a quantitative person, but it is very interesting, and I think will provide some insights to all who are interested in these issues.
Thank you. Thank you again to all our amazing speakers and the audience for joining us. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.